Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be making sopa de ajo. That means in Spanish, garlic soup. Spanish cooking is very different from some of the other sorts of cooking that I've demonstrated so far. In many ways, it's sort of simplicity perfected. While most other cuisines very oftentimes look at what more you can add, Spanish cooking strikes me very much as focused on what's the minimum that you can put in a dish and have it come out well. Consequently, it's a little different. I should say at this point that I've never lived in Spain. This is the first dish I've demonstrated that I've learned specifically from working with people from the places where it's from. And it's still one of my favorite foods. It's almost sort of the perfect comfort food. Now, there are a few different variations of sopa de ajo that are worth mentioning before we get started. I'm going to make a very simple minimalistic version. The broth is made exclusively from olive oil, garlic, and bread. Sometimes people like to use chicken broth instead of water. This can be done. Of course, you need to adjust salt and things like that. And occasionally, sometimes people will add a little bit of Spanish ham on the top. But the basic dish is extremely simple. It's just garlic, olive oil, bread, water, a little bit of spices, and eggs, which are poached in it. What you end up with, though, is a really rich, thick, delicious soup. And so next we'll go over the ingredients. So on to our ingredients. The primary broth is basically olive oil. Here we have, in this case, just a German olive oil. One thing I would make absolutely clear, though, is that the quality of the product you'll get out in any Spanish cooking depends very much on the quality of the olive oil that you use. If you can, you want to use a really high quality Spanish olive oil that's extra virgin, and that's going to be the basic thing. I don't have that with me right now, so I'm going to go ahead and work with what I have. And the second thing we will add is an entire head of garlic. Finally, we will add bread, then water, and then we poach eggs in it at the end. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this head of garlic, and I'm going to separate it into cloves. I'm going to use the whole thing here. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make about 4 servings worth of the broth, but I'm only going to prepare 1 to eat now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, you can see it's nicely separated into cloves, and then we take the cloves and I'm going to peel them. If you've never peeled garlic, there are a bunch of different ways of doing it. My favorite is just simply to take it, twist it a little bit, you'll feel the skin come right off. Then I'm going to go ahead and chop the garlic, and it's got to get chopped relatively finely. So here we have a head of garlic that's been chopped. I'm going to go ahead and set it aside, and I'm going to start prepping my bread. It's kind of good to get the garlic and the bread prepped before you get into cooking. Now, what I have here is ciabatta. What you really need is you need a nice spongy white bread, preferably something that's a bit meaty. That's why I chose ciabatta. Don't use sourdough. The broth will not come out the right consistency if you do that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, I'm just going to go ahead and not worry about the garlic on the knife, but I might actually need a bread knife, so maybe I'll switch that. I'm going to cut the ends off of one of the loaves. What I need to do is I need to remove the crust. The ends can come in nice when it comes time to sort of present this. I'm going to go ahead and cut the ends off. We'll come back to them later. And then I'm going to go ahead and just basically just cut the In fact, I'm just going to cut this into like 3 pieces. And I'm going to use about half of this loaf too. Maybe that side looks a little better. So once again, I've taken 1.5 loaves of this ciabatta. It is a nice spongy white bread, not a sourdough, and I've chosen it because of the texture and things like that. So I've cut the heels off. The heels are here. I'll set them aside for later, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just trim the crusts off. And once the crusts are off, I will tear it into pieces. Once it's torn into pieces, in fact, once that part's off, I can just scoop out the middle, and then I will tear it into pieces. And basically, pieces are going to be about like this. The bread is actually really super important when it comes to the consistency of the broth. We'll get into why as I start to cook it. And so now I have the crusts and the heel set over here. I have the rest of the bread over here torn into pieces. I'm going to take my pot and I'm going to pour in about 250 milliliters of olive oil here. Now this is 750. It's a little over half full, so that's 350. So I want to leave about 100 milliliters left in the bottle. Not looking more than that. Maybe I'll only do 200, I don't know. And it's going to look like a whole lot of olive oil, and it is. Well, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the garlic, and I'm going to turn this on to approximately a medium heat. So in this case, maybe like a 6 or so, or 7. And I'm going to go ahead and let the garlic get stirred in as this just kind of gets warmed up. And we're going to go ahead and let this cook until it becomes nice and fragrant. Now while that is heating up, I'm now going to take some of my crusts, and this is just this is a purely optional thing, but especially if you're trying to kind of have a nice meal, it can be a good thing. I'm going to slice them into strips, and these are going to go basically on a plate with some olive oil and other dipping stuff, and that can basically be a nice appetizer. Now you can hear that this is starting to fry nicely, and I can start to smell it that it's getting fragrant. So I'm going to turn the heat down to 5 or 6, and I'm going to start stirring in all the bread. Bread goes in, and now I'm going to stir this until everything starts to brown up a little bit. Now, for those of you kind of familiar with American or French cooking terms, what we're doing basically here is we're making a roux, but instead of using flour, we're actually using bread. And so we have to let things fry enough that they will thicken when we add the water. While it is still frying, I'm going to go ahead and season it. I'm going to add just a dash of spicy paprika. If you don't have any spicy paprika, like you're in the US or something, you could add maybe a dash of sweet paprika and a dash of cayenne pepper. And then I'm going to add a bit of black pepper and a little bit of just a little bit of salt. pepper. Actually, I think in this case I'm going to let the salt go when I add the broth. There we go. So one of the things you'll notice fairly quickly is that all of the olive oil is going to soak up into the bread. And this has not started to brown yet, but it's going to take a while. But this is basically the way it works and the way it looks. And what seems like a lot of olive oil now leads to a lot of olive oil soaked bread. As we cook this, everything's going to slowly start to brown a bit. And once it kind of gets to be a nice golden brown, then we will consider it ready for adding water and turning it into a broth. So at that point I'll add water and salt, and then we'll get a broth. So now you can see that it's starting to brown up a little bit. It's not really quite there yet. Now, one thing obviously here is that because we're dealing with garlic, it's kind of important to stir it reasonably well this whole time it's browning. So keep that in mind, and it'll take a few more minutes. So far I have been cooking this here for about 15, maybe 20 minutes. It'll probably take another 5 before I'm ready to add the water. So now it's been 20 or 25 minutes. I've been cooking and stirring this, and I just kind of want to bring this up close so you can see it. You can see the bread is starting to brown a little bit. The garlic starting to become sort of a light little golden brown. Remember, garlic you have to be a little careful of. Some of these pieces are getting a little darker, and so we're going to go ahead and add water and salt now. So let's add a bit of salt. I never really measure. I'll come back and adjust. Keep in mind this is a fairly rich broth, so you probably need less salt than you would if it was like a standard meat broth. That's also a major reason to use water instead of chicken broth. If you use chicken broth, do not add water at this point. I'm going to go ahead and add some water, and then I'll bring this back on to a hard boil. So I'm just going to add water in the sink here. And now you can see the oil starting to float to the top. And I'm going to bring this up for a hard boil. So now we have this boiling. I'm going to go ahead and stir it for a while. And as I do, basically the roux that we created will basically help most of the olive oil dissolve into the broth. And this is going to thicken up and become a really kind of thick garlic broth. Then I will taste it and adjust the seasonings, and from there we'll go, probably adjust the salt. And then from there, we'll do the final phase. But typically you want to boil this hard for about 5 minutes, stirring it, or 10 minutes, sorry, stirring it. And that'll help the broth to start to thicken. So this has been at a hard boil for about 10 minutes. You'll notice that this starts to get really pretty thick. And whenever I stop stirring it, it bubbles pretty quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and taste it and adjust. Definitely needs more salt. Salt is one of the difficult things to address on this recipe because of the fact that the broth is fairly rich, and also because it's fairly dependent upon the quality and nature of some of the ingredients you add. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn this down so it doesn't spatter too much. Turned it down to about a 3. I want to just set it up so it simmers just gently. And I'm going to finish this off. And for each portion that you're going to eat right now, what you're going to do is you're going to take an egg and you are going to poach it in the broth. Just remember where you put it. And we'll leave that there for about 3 minutes or so, and then we'll go ahead and serve. In the meantime, I've gone ahead and I've arranged the bread crust strips onto a plate with some olive oil, my side or appetizer. We could add tapas things, otherwise kind of just make a nice platter there. And now we're ready to serve. Remember that my egg was over here, so let's scoop it out. And this comes out kind of like a, almost like a porridge. And then I can top it with just another hair of the paprika as a garnish. So that is sopa de ajo, or Spanish garlic soup. My view of Spanish cooking is that it's all about quality of ingredients, especially olive oil, patience, and you definitely don't want to get ahead of yourself and try to cook everything in too hot a temperature, for example. So take your time, cook it slowly. It's one of my favorite foods for the winter. It really lifts my spirits up. If you want to make a gluten-free version of it, sometimes I've gone ahead and used leftover rice instead of bread. Maybe about 200, 300 grams. In the bread I used about 500 grams of bread. Approximately a pound for you American folks. Again, can't use sourdough. It needs to be a white bread. And just don't cook it too fast.